How can the Constitution really fortify American democracy? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport, tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. The most powerful document in American history was written with an overarching goal in mind: prevent tyranny. But when we talk about the Constitution today, we often think of it in narrow terms. When we're arguing about something being constitutional, it seems to me that we're asking if it's explicitly written in the Constitution or at the very least implied. We're not asking how the Constitution serves as a bulwark against tyranny or as a living framework for democracy. To answer these larger philosophical questions, we are joined by Melissa Murray. She's the Frederick I and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU School of Law, co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast, and a legal analyst for MS Now. Her new book is The U.S. Constitution, a comprehensive and annotated guide for the modern reader. And before we start, if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent podcast, please leave us a review on your podcast app. Whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere in between, it really goes a long way for Future Hindsight to be discovered. Thank you. Welcome, Melissa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, first of all, I learned so much in reading this book. You explain each article and amendment in a nutshell after you quote it in its entirety. And then you add the origin story and close with a commentary on cases decided by the Supreme Court or how the Constitution has been used in history. I also understood for the first time since I read this book just how future-forward the framers were, which I think is often lost when we talk about the Constitution. So anyone who reads this book will get so much out of it. I highly recommend it. You know, I've been doing this podcast for 8 years now, a civic engagement podcast. And as I was reading it, I was really wondering, who were you writing this book for and why did you write it?
So it's a terrific question. I guess I can start by telling you the book's origin story, if you will. There was a period of time, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was on Twitter a lot. I'm no longer on Twitter. It's become a little too much for me. But there was a period in time where I really, really enjoyed it. And one day, I was on Twitter and I noticed Luke Campbell of 2 Live Crew, and he was talking about all of the things that he wished President Joe Biden would do. And so he had this whole list of things. Some of it involved, domestic oil prices and gas prices. Some of it involved things that he wanted to see vis-a-vis police brutality, whatever. And as I was reading through this litany of things that President Joe Biden could or should be doing, it occurred to me that some of the things were outside of the scope of presidential authority entirely. And it made me wonder, does Luke Campbell know what the president is authorized to do? Has Luke Campbell read Article 2 of the Constitution? And I think the answer is probably no. I think a lot of people in our country talk about the Constitution, make constitutional claims reflexively, like, you violated my First Amendment rights. But I don't think very many people have spent time reading the entire document. You may know what certain provisions say or what they do in principle, but you haven't actually sat down and read the whole document. And that's unfortunate because not only were the framers future forward, they very much wanted the document to be read and debated and grappled with. They're very explicit. Not everything is written down. Not everything that could be documented is actually contemplated at the time that they're drafting the Constitution. They recognize that this is a document that's going to be written in broad brushstrokes, and there's going to have to be interpretation. People are going to have to fill things in. Maybe things are going to have to be changed. And they write a document, though, that is meant for the people to have access to. They want something the people will debate, and they recognize if it's too long, if it's too arcane, that's actually not going to happen. So this was a document that starts with we the people, and it was intended to be used and documented and debated by we the people.
Oh, excellent. This is great. Well, I have a lot of questions about we the people and how we can really use the Constitution. But I mentioned in the intro that we are not normally asking how the Constitution serves as a bulwark against tyranny. And while we hear, actually nowadays, the word tyranny quite frequently, I didn't really fully comprehend that preventing tyranny was the major or a major animating drive in writing the Constitution. How do you think about the Constitution protecting everyday Americans from tyranny?
I'm not sure that preventing tyranny was the exclusive reason. I think it is one of many reasons. And I think you have to first start with the origin stories of the framers. Like, these were men who I think were writing a document in a state of trauma. When I say the Constitution is a trauma-informed document, I don't mean it in the way we might think of it today, but there was trauma in their background. They had endured the trauma of what they viewed as oppression by the British king and the British Parliament during the colonial period. Britain had taxed them mercilessly, had sent a standing army to live among them in their towns, that they were required to house these soldiers and put them up on their own dime. So they were living with that trauma from the colonial period. They also had this more recent trauma of fighting a revolutionary war against a global superpower, the most important superpower the world had yet seen. And they were basically doing it with this loose collection of 13 states that were bound together in what was effectively a friendship bracelet of government. And so it was a horrible experience trying to transact trades with other nations, to make deals, to fund this war. They were doing it without the benefit of an actual government, a working government, and that was traumatic for them too. And so when they sit down to write the US Constitution, they are thinking about both of these experiences. They want a document that will enable them to have the kind of robust central government that would allow them to transact foreign affairs, have, relationships with other nations, maybe borrow money from other nations as they had done during the Revolutionary War. But they also want a central government that isn't too powerful, because that is actually what happened with Parliament. Parliament was too powerful. The king was too powerful. And so their idea is that the government, the federal government, will have certain powers, and they will divide those powers among these three coordinate branches of the federal government. So there is Congress, the legislative branch, the president, the executive branch, and then there are the courts. And I think that by diffusing power among those three branches and allowing each branch to check the other, no single branch will be able to consolidate authority and become tyrannical. And then they take a second step, which is to say, they don't give all of the power to the federal government. They divide the power between the federal government and the states. So the federal government can do certain things, but then the states also retain their sovereignty to do certain things too. And they think that version of divided government, divided horizontally, divided vertically, will be enough to protect against the prospect of a government that is too powerful, that can run roughshod over the people. And that's basically the framework for the original Constitution. Now, the original Constitution doesn't stay original for that long. Some people think that that's not enough protection for the people, and what they want is an explicit documentation of the rights that the people have against the federal government. And so as the Constitution is being ratified, they are also thinking about and proposing what becomes the Bill of Rights, a series of 10 amendments, including the First Amendment with its protections for freedom of religion and freedom of speech, that are adopted in close proximity to the ratification of the Constitution as well.
Right. We're going to get to the Bill of Rights, because I think this is something that's also maybe, I don't know, I want to say underutilized as everyday Americans, or misunderstood how we could potentially utilize it. I want to make a connection here between we the people and guarding against tyrannical behavior from, let's say, the federal government, as we have seen the executive when the president called in the National Guard, or the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act. And the question I have here when it comes to the Constitution is the only recourse in using the Constitution going to court? Because that seems, honestly, like a big hurdle that's really not accessible to all.
It's a great question. Is the only thing that you can do to make claims on the Constitution to file a lawsuit and to go forward through the federal courts? No. First, it's not the only place you can file a lawsuit. You can file a lawsuit in federal courts, but there are also state courts, and states have constitutions. Many state constitutions are actually more generative of individual rights than is the federal Constitution. The federal Constitution mostly has negative rights, which is to say that the federal Constitution protects against the government doing something, but it doesn't actually authorize the government or demand that the government affirmatively provide you with something, whereas many state constitutions actually do provide positive rights. So some state constitutions have a positive right to education. It's not just that the government can't deny you an education. They are affirmatively required to give you one, to give you a certain level of education. So you can proceed in state courts under state constitutions and state statutes to advance your rights in those ways as well. You can also make claims on the Constitution through the Constitution itself. And almost every official in our government is a constitutional actor in some way. It's not just the Supreme Court that says what the Constitution is. The court may have the last word on certain questions, but it's not the only actor that's making constitutional claims. We've seen the President of the United States over the course of the last 2 years through a series of executive orders announce his views of what the law is or should be, often in contradistinction to what the courts have said. So, the president in a series of executive orders directed at law firms and educational institutions has said that any consideration of race, whether it is, a program that is meant to ameliorate the lack of representation of women and minorities in certain programs, he says that's impermissible DEI. No court has ever said that. The Supreme Court may have limited the use of race in college admissions, but they've never said you can't have a women's affinity group at your law firm or a women's engineering group at your college. The president announced that. That's his version of what the Constitution says. And, the president's version is not like Taylor's version. It's not my number one. We're waiting for the court perhaps to weigh in on some of those questions as those executive orders get challenged, although many of those executive orders haven't been challenged because we know many law firms have acceded to those requests from the administration. And so we're not getting a lot of adjudication on those questions. And because we're not getting a lot of adjudication on those questions, it's almost like the president's word is standing. And I'm not quite sure that that's what the Constitution had in mind. Congress also makes claims on the Constitution as well. And we saw in a series of voting rights decisions from the 1980s, the court came out with a number of different interpretations of how the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was supposed to work. And Congress said, no, that's actually not what we think it's supposed to do. And they passed and reauthorized new provisions of the Voting Rights Act to make that law work in the way that Congress thought it should work. So we're constantly seeing an interplay between different branches of the federal government. The states often articulate their own versions of what they think the Constitution looks like. Some of these wind up in federal court, obviously, but as we've seen with the executive orders, many of them don't. The other way that you can make constitutional claims is the people themselves making constitutional claims, trying to harness the amendment process to create change in and of itself. And I document this in the book at length. We talk about constitutional change proceeding through the Congress, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments that were passed after the Civil War that abolished slavery and tried to make this a multiracial democracy. But there are also a series of amendments that come at the turn of the century, the Gilded Age, where the people of the United States, working class people, are looking around and they're seeing enormous consolidation of wealth, massive income inequality, and a federal government that raises money by issuing tariffs that are disproportionately borne by the working class. And they don't want it anymore. They want an income tax that would allow the rich to be taxed and pay their fair share, a progressive tax. The problem, of course, is that Article 1 doesn't allow for that. And so they launch a campaign to change Article 1, and they succeed with the 16th Amendment that supersedes this provision of Article 1, replaces it, and allows for the levying of a progressive income tax. And that's the income tax that we live with today. The whole genesis of it was to make the rich pay their fair share.
Yeah, that's been around for a long time, taxing the rich.
Yeah, and it's borne by the people. Today, it's such a hallmark of progressivism. It was a hallmark of progressivism then, but
yes,
their whole idea is that everyone needs to pay their fair share.
Yes, 100%. I have so many questions now. So let's go one by one. One of the questions I have is about how you think about the Constitution's original architecture, and whether it empowers or frustrates ordinary citizens' ability to participate in democracy. And you just mentioned that ordinary people banded together and lobbied for and was able to pass this constitutional amendment. But in this current environment where there aren't any movements that are very strong, let's say, to have a constitutional amendment in this moment, the year 2026, and Congress really not working properly the way that I would say the Constitution intended, and the executive trying to gain more power in this moment. How do you think about that architecture, the way that it was originally framed? Originally is maybe a fraught word, but
So I think it's a terrific question. The Constitution itself, the original Constitution, the first 7 articles, they're created in the late 1780s. And I'll be very honest, they're imperfect. They're meant to, I think, limit popular participation in government in certain ways. Our founding fathers were somewhat elitist. They believed that democracy was something to be done by the better classes, so property-owning white men. It wasn't until much later that property ownership wasn't a requirement for voting, but at the time the Constitution is ratified, that's what they're thinking. And they actually have a real suspicion of popular movements. They worry about the people, and they worry that the masses are ill-equipped to actually participate meaningfully in the whole practice of democracy, that they may not be educated, that they may not have the values that are necessary to sustain democracy. And there are certain features of the Constitution that speak and reflect that kind of impulse. So, for example, today we elect our senators popularly. So everyone in a state votes for the senators, and, the person who wins goes to the Senate. But originally, the senators were selected by state legislatures, while the House of Representatives was selected by the popular vote. Their understanding was that maybe a better class of people would be selected by the state legislatures. The 17th Amendment, which is one of those amendments passed during that populist period in the late 1800s, changes that and moves toward the popular election of senators. But there's still that distrust. You see it in the Electoral College. The president isn't selected by the people. It's instead selected by these representatives of the state, the electors, who cast their votes. And, today, the electors often heed the popular interest in the state. They will vote the way the majority of the state votes in the presidential election. But at a time when there's so much partisan division, and often partisan affiliation is evenly divided in a state, it may be the case that electors are selecting the popular preference, but the preference isn't that stark. It may actually be, as it is in some states, sort of 50-50 Democrat and Republican. And in that sense, the Constitution, in its distrust, I think, of popular movements, also reflects a little bit of minority rule, like certainly in the Senate, the Electoral College being the most pernicious one, I think. The other thing I would say, though, about the Constitution is this balance that the framers are trying to strike in making the Constitution something that can be amended, but also not making it too easy to amend it, in part because if you can change constitutional rights and you can change the structures and what's required, you can also run roughshod over the people's rights. So, in a way, Article 5, which sets out the protocols for amending the Constitution, it's meant to be a little difficult. You have to go through either state constitutional conventions or the Congress. And then if you get a supermajority in either of those venues, you then go on to the state legislatures and you have to get a supermajority there. Those are very hard to do. It's even harder now today, where we have the overlay of partisan gerrymandering in state legislatures, where state legislatures may not be as representative of the popular will as we would like. That makes amending the Constitution even harder. I don't think the framers were necessarily counting on the shifts in our electoral landscape that exist today, but I do think they were trying to make a document that could change, but that wasn't too easy to change.
Yeah, I think they did strike a really good balance given the environment in which they were living in. We didn't have 50 states at the time. We didn't have as many Americans at the time. And it's very difficult, like you said, to anticipate all this. We'll be back with Melissa in just a moment. So stick around. You've got to hear this episode's Civic Spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, picture this. It's late at night and you're doing a little scrolling when all of a sudden you see it, that one product that you've been looking for. You click on the link, add to cart, and maybe even shop around a little more before finally hitting checkout. But as you're filling in your address, you realize you don't have your card anywhere near you. And that's when you see it. That purple pay button that has all of your information saved, making checkout as simple as a simple tap of your screen. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. From household names like Momofuku to up-and-coming brands that are just getting started. And Shopify is there for you too. Accelerate your efficiency, whether you're uploading new products or trying to improve existing ones. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. Now, you might be wondering, what if people haven't heard about my brand? It's okay. Shopify helps you find your customers with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns. So tackle all those important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool that you need. Everything is all in one spot, making your life easier and your business operations smoother. What I love about Shopify is how no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. See fewer carts go abandoned and more sales go cha-ching with Shopify and their Shop Pay button. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. That's shopify.com/hopeful. We also want to share about a podcast we think you'll enjoy called Democracy Under Construction.
This year, the United States celebrates its 250th anniversary as a nation, but not as a democracy. Activists and organizers are still working on expanding civil rights and voting rights so they apply to everyone, even as other actors try to strip those rights away. I'm Alex Levitt, host of The Context, a podcast from the Charles F. Kettering Foundation about how to make democracy work for everyone and why that's so hard to do. This spring, in honor of America's semi-sesquicentennial, we're running a special series. It's called Democracy Under Construction. Over 3 episodes, we'll spotlight some of the most significant struggles in the fight to get our nation to live up to its inclusive ideals. And we're bringing on some all-star guests, like civil rights lawyer Sherilyn Ifill and Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project. Join us in celebrating this country's anniversary by acknowledging its true history and by gearing up for the work yet to be done. Listen to The Context every other Tuesday. The series begins April 7th.
And now, let's return to my conversation with Melissa Murray. I have a question about the Voting Rights Act, which has been systematically dismantled now by the Supreme Court.
Yes.
It seems to me that the Reconstruction Amendments that you mentioned before, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, isn't there a way to use these as a robust rebuttal to these efforts to dismantle the Voting Rights Act? Or is there something else? Is there another tool idling within the Constitution that we could be using to fight back?
I document in the book the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And one of the things that I try to make really clear is that these 3 amendments represent a second founding moment for the country. It is a moment where the country, riven by the bloodiest war that's ever been fought on American soil, a war over the state's prerogative to own people, leaves the country absolutely broken. And they have to reknit this country and this Constitution back together. And they don't want it to be what it was before. Like, that much is clear. They are not only abolishing the institution of slavery, they're trying to figure out how to take these formerly enslaved people and render them part of the political community and ensure their rights, because they recognize from the start that although the former Confederate states are coming back into the Union, many of them are coming back grudgingly. Many of them do not believe in this idea of a multiracial democracy, and they are worried that the South will reconstruct a racial hierarchy in the absence of slavery. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are intended to prevent that. The 13th Amendment obviously abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment speaks to the citizenship of the formerly enslaved and all others born here in the United States or naturalized therein. It also speaks to certain rights that can be claimed not only against the government broadly, but the states as well. Like, this is a moment where they recognize that the federal government isn't the only actor that can be tyrannical, but that states may also run roughshod over the rights of individuals. And then finally, they really want to protect against the resurgence of a dummy confederacy or a shadow confederacy. And they think the best way to deal with that is to enfranchise African American men and allow them to be part of the political community in a meaningful way as voters, letting them have a say in this democratic project. That's the basic gist of the Reconstruction Amendments. And if you start from that point, this idea that the current Supreme Court is offering that, the Reconstruction Amendments are utterly colorblind and that what they prohibit is any consideration of race just doesn't hold water. It doesn't make sense at all. When they were framing the Reconstruction Amendments, they were very race conscious because they knew they had to think about all of the ways that the South would try to create a racial hierarchy. They recognized that it might happen explicitly, like just generally putting Black people back in bondage, or it might happen in more subtle race-neutral ways. Like, instead of saying, hey, Black people, you can't vote, they would say, hey, everybody has to pay a toll tax. But if your grandfather voted in the last 4 elections, you don't have to pay a poll tax. Well, guess who that affects? It's totally race neutral, but it's obviously intended to disenfranchise African Americans. They knew all of that. They were thinking about it. To say, as the Supreme Court has said today, that even thinking about race when you are trying to remedy past racial discrimination, whether it is in the drawing of congressional maps or in addressing suppressive voter practices, that even thinking about race as you try to remedy past racial discrimination, that's actually also race discrimination, that would have been ludicrous to the framers of the Reconstruction Amendments. And I don't know what this court is on in terms of their understanding of the Reconstruction Amendments, but I think you have to think about what the court is doing in light of what we are seeing in other parts of society. Most kids in public schools, maybe even private schools today, are not learning about the Reconstruction Amendments. They don't know about what the 14th Amendment does, what it was trying to do, the intricacies of it. We know who the founders of America were, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. We know who the framers of the Constitution were, James Madison. We never know the names of the framers of the 14th Amendment, of the 15th Amendment. We don't know who John Bingham is. We don't know who Lyman Trumbull is. We don't know who Thaddeus Stevens is. And I think that's by design. Because if those figures are not part of our civic mythology, then that means the Reconstruction Amendments don't have the same pride of place as the original Constitution does. And this is a court that loves to fetishize the original Constitution, loves to go back. Let's think about what the framers thought about this. Well, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment and the 13th Amendment, they had framers too. And if we're going to do that kind of constitutional interpretation, we need to start with them. And for that reason, we need the public, the people, to know who those men were, who those women were, who are making claims on the Constitution, changing the Constitution, and putting forth a new document for a new kind of democracy.
Yeah, well said. I haven't thought about it that way, that we really need to talk about the framers for those Reconstruction Amendments and really talk about them and venerate them in the same way that we venerate the original framers.
And we can't do that if we have bans on quote unquote critical race in the I mean, like, the ban on critical race is basically to stop talking about slavery. And you can't talk about these men if you're not going to talk about all of the history. There's so many places in our original Constitution where there are references to slavery, not explicit, but everyone understands what they are talking about. It's in Article 1, it's in Article 4, it's all over this original document. And the 14th, the 15th Amendment, the 13th Amendment are meant to eradicate that. But if we're not talking about that peculiar institution and the hold it had on the earliest parts of our history, we're not going to get to the shift that the Reconstruction Amendments create. We're not going to get to the civil rights movement. And I think that's kind of the point.
Yeah. Well, so I have a question about how the Bill of Rights fits in, because, at the same time that the framers did this, they also, the Anti-Federalists, wanted to make sure the federal government did not infringe on individual rights. And one could argue, of course, that being disenfranchised is an infringement on my individual rights. Mm-hmm. So in the context of democracy in the 21st century, how do you think the Bill of Rights fits in?
I think the Bill of Rights fits in very clear ways. I mean, I think this is a court that actually fetishizes certain parts of the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment, certainly, freedom of religion, not necessarily the anti-establishment aspect of the religion clauses, but they definitely venerate the idea of free exercise of religion, often in the context of Christian evangelicalism. They venerate the Second Amendment quite a bit, and I think have expanded beyond what the framers would have intended our understanding of the Second Amendment. They are less good about the Ninth Amendment, which is actually really interesting because the Ninth Amendment says that nothing that's actually been enumerated here should indicate that there are other rights that aren't explicit here, but that also count. I mean, the Ninth Amendment basically is, I think, underwriting the prospect of unenumerated rights, like rights to bodily autonomy that this court has run roughshod over. So there's a lot of room for perfecting our understanding of the Bill of Rights, but I think this court likes certain parts of the Bill of Rights and maybe is less up to speed on some of the others.
I mean, it seems to me that the Ninth Amendment would be one avenue to use for getting voting rights back on track.
That could be one. It could also be a means of thinking about reproductive rights. Again, the 14th Amendment, I think, still provides a lot of room, and the 15th Amendment as well, for recalibrating voting rights. The 14th Amendment, Section 5, authorizes Congress to enact legislation to achieve the aims of the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment also has an enforcement clause, Section 2. The 19th Amendment, which enfranchised women, doubling the size of the electorate in 1920, also has an enforcement clause that is rarely used, but maybe it should be used or should at least be thought about in the context of this new proposed legislation, the SAVE Act, which may, because of the requirements it imposes, disenfranchise a whole generation of women who had the temerity to take their husband's name and now don't have identifying documents with their original name or with their changed name on it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, what do you think is a common misconception about the Constitution that people talk about commonly today that has negatively affected the health of American democracy?
One thing that I think people talk about all the time is this idea that constitutional rights apply against everyone. So you can be on Twitter, for example, and people will say, Twitter has violated my rights. Like, Twitter banned me. I have constitutional rights. One person in particular at our government often says this, that certain platforms have violated his rights under the First Amendment. The First Amendment only applies against state actors, so the federal government and the states. And it is true that some people may be wish casting the idea that Twitter will become an arm of the state. Maybe it already has become an arm of the state, hard to say. But it hasn't been formally acknowledged as such, which means the First Amendment doesn't apply. And so, one thing I think cannot be emphasized enough is that the Constitution actually doesn't apply against a range of private actors. Only the 13th Amendment actually limits private actors and private actions. Most of the Constitution is intended to apply against state actors, the federal government, the states, municipalities. And that is because at bottom, the Constitution is a document that is about restraining the state. It is a document that's meant to achieve an ideal of limited government on the view that limited government is necessary for democracy because the people don't have rights if the government has too many.
Yes, exactly. So let's talk about the Supreme Court. You mentioned the Supreme Court several times already, and I have already mentioned also that the Supreme Court is hard at work to increase the power of the executive. How does Article 3 in the Constitution actually envision the judiciary to work?
Well, it's actually a great question. Article 3 is probably the least developed article in the Constitution about the three branches. I mean, you've read the book, you know that they write a very long article for Article 1. When I was reading Article 1 for the audiobook,
Yes,
I was like,
very
wow,
long.
when is this over? Wow. We were like,
Still going.
And yeah, it's like, here we go, still going. And I think part of that is because they were really, really traumatized by what the British Parliament had done during the colonial period. So when they're setting up this government, they're actually really worried about the prospect of a federal legislature with too much power. So they spend a lot of time trying to think about what Parliament does and what it should not do and what a federal legislature should not be able to do. The executive is far less detailed than the legislature is in Article 1. So Article 2 is much more loosey-goosey than Article 1. And that has led to certainly a lot of questions over time about the scope and substance of presidential power. But Article 3 is even less defined than Article 2. It really is almost an afterthought, so much so that Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers refers to the judiciary as the least dangerous branch. Like they just don't even contemplate that the Supreme Court is going to be able to do that much. They really understand the president and Congress to have most of the power of the purse, the power of the sword. They don't really anticipate that the Supreme Court's going to be a huge player here. And the Supreme Court doesn't become a huge player until about 1803 when the court decides Marbury versus Madison, and John Marshall, not the first Chief Justice, but the second, he rests for the Supreme Court this authority to say what the law is, this power of judicial review that is nowhere explicated in the original Constitution, but according to him, is implicit in the whole idea of writing down the Constitution. Like, the United States has the longest enduring written constitution in history. Britain doesn't have a written constitution. The United States does. And John Marshall says, what's the point of writing it down if, one, you don't want the people to read it, and two, you don't want someone to go through it and make sure that you're living up to it? And who's going to decide if we're living up to it? We are. The courts are going to do that. And so, there's a real debate over time about the propriety of judicial review, the legitimacy of judicial review. Why should 9 unelected officials get to say what the law is? But judicial review has endured. It is a fundamental way that the Constitution has sort of kept pace with modernity. Some people don't like that. Other people welcome it. But that's the power that the court has wrested for itself. And some would argue that it is the power that has transformed the least dangerous branch into perhaps the most dangerous branch.
Yeah. Well, so my next question is about what you have learned in writing this book about what you think is in urgent need of change. That could be amendments, that could be new laws, changing how we think. Anything that would give us a more robust, more inclusive, more resilient democracy.
Sure. So one thing I think needs to happen is we've got to have a Congress. We haven't had a real working Congress for some time. Part of that is because of partisan division. It's just really hard right now in terms of actually getting things done in Congress. So that's part of it. We need a Congress that's willing to use its authority. And Congress has actually quite a lot of authority, certainly the powers that are enumerated in Article 1. And there are tons of power located in the enforcement clauses of many of the amendments that have subsequently been added to the Constitution. So the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments all have enforcement clauses that authorize Congress to enact legislation in furtherance of the terms of those amendments. The 19th Amendment also has one. The 19th Amendment is the amendment that enfranchises women. The 26th Amendment has an enforcement clause. The 26th Amendment is the one that lowers the voting age to 18. So the For the People Act, which was meant to do more to empower voting, it died in Congress, but it was authorized, at least in part, under the enforcement clause of the 26th Amendment. We just need more congressional will to actually enact these pieces of legislation. To that point, we need to get a handle on partisan gerrymandering. Congress is not a representative body. right? It just isn't because of the way these maps are drawn. The Supreme Court's recent decision from a couple of weeks ago in May in Louisiana versus Calais makes the House of Representatives much less representative. Senate is already, I think, not as representative as it should be because each state gets 2 senators regardless of the population of the state. So, California and Wyoming have the same amount of clout in the Senate. Some would argue that that's preposterous, but here we are. If the House of Representatives is supposed to speak to that kind of popular representation, it should represent the people better than it does. And one of the reasons it doesn't now is because of partisan gerrymandering. And the Supreme Court, in a 2019 case called Rucho versus Common Cause, effectively said that federal courts have nothing to say and can say nothing about partisan gerrymandering. And what we've seen since that decision is states redrawing their map to consolidate partisan advantage. That also has racial dimensions because, especially in the South, partisan affiliation and race track very closely. Many Black voters in the South are Democrats, which means if you are gerrymandering to consolidate partisan advantage, you're probably doing it in a way that's sticking it to minority voters. And this is what the Voting Rights Act was supposed to prevent. It's what Justice Alito, in that decision from a few weeks ago, Louisiana Calais, says that you can't do. That the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment doesn't allow you to think about race, even if you are trying to remedy that kind of discrimination. There's so many places to start. I would start with Congress doing more to limit gerrymandering, doing more to exercise its authority. And I would also turn to the people. We have to do more. This is a document that was meant to be read by us. Who's read it? Seriously think about that. If you haven't read the Constitution, why haven't you? You don't have to buy this Constitution, although I would love for you to do so because it has
Yes.
tons of content here about what this document was meant to do. But the Constitution's available. Go look at it, read it, think about what it means. Think about this whole idea of divided government, the fears that the framers had of a government with too much power. They were so preoccupied with the idea that the federal government would have access to a standing army and would send that standing army into the cities to run roughshod over the rights of the people. What would they think about this moment?
Yeah.
What would they think about the idea that we are literally contemplating of armed people at polling places during an election? Would they have been okay with this? I think they probably wouldn't have.
Yeah, probably not. Well, it's a perfect segue to my next question. Every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guests to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights that you've just shared with us into action for all of us, we the people?
So one thing I think we all can do is commit to voting. And I know it sounds so Pollyanna-ish, just go vote. I'm not saying that if you just turn out and vote, everything's going to be better. There are headwinds in our faces, to be sure. Partisan gerrymandering has distorted the electoral landscape. It means that voter turnout has to actually be monumental in order to counteract the distortion created by these unrepresentative practices like partisan gerrymandering. But it starts with one person. If you can get out to the polls, if you can register to vote, if you can make sure you have the documents that you need, that you can check on what's going on, that you have everything that you need in order to vote, and then get some friends and have them do the same thing. We cannot counteract what they have done to our electoral landscape unless we are willing to do the work, put in the effort, and put our backs into it, bring more people out, double the size of this electorate. In the 2024 election, roughly a third of Americans sat it out. It was one of the most consequential elections of our lifetime. We were debating about whether or not we were going to have standing armies in the street. I don't know if people recognize what was at stake, but it should be clear right now what is at stake. And that means we've got to redouble our efforts. Voting is not a panacea. Again, there are so many headwinds, But it is a start, and it's the only way that we can hope to undo some of this, at least on the local level and in person at this point. And then call your congressman, like tell them that you are looking at all of these things that are happening and that you have questions, you have answers. You can call your congressman and ask them, like, what is your stance on court reform? I just saw Justice Alito write this decision that seems to have eviscerated the Voting Rights Act. What are we doing about it? What are you doing about it? Start making demands of your elected representatives. They've basically reorganized Congress so it isn't representative of the people and their needs. Well, even if your needs aren't likely to be translated in your representatives' actions, you can still be a fly in the ointment for that person. Call them up every day. Like, we need to be more persistent about bugging our elected officials.
Yeah, hear, hear. Last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful is the history that I've documented in this book. The book ends with the story of the 27th Amendment. It's the last amendment to be added to the Constitution. It was added in 1992, and it was the work of a college student. This guy, Gregory Watson, was a student at the University of Texas, Austin, and he had to write a term paper. He wrote a term paper about amendments that were never ratified. And he focused on this one amendment that had been proposed in 1791 alongside many of the Bill of Rights amendments. It ultimately wasn't ratified. It was one of 12, only 10 get ratified. It sort of lays dormant for 200 years, and he comes across it during this term paper research. He writes the term paper, gets a C on the term paper, but says, you know what? I'm not taking this lying down. He thinks that this amendment makes a lot of sense. It's an amendment that prevents Congress from raising its compensation in a term in which the voting representatives are serving. And he says, like, why not? He starts calling around, calls a senator from Maine, who in turn puts him in touch with members of various state legislatures, and he goes to work. And in 1992, more than 200 years after this amendment is proposed, he gets it ratified, and it becomes the last amendment to the Constitution, this compensation amendment. And he's just a college student doing term paper research. And to his credit, he got that C changed to an A. The University of Texas at Austin changes his grade, but he changed the Constitution. And we all need to embody that kind of optimism, faith in democracy, and faith in our own ability to be constitutional change makers.
Yes, hear, hear. This is the best news ever. I mean, I'm familiar with the story, but yes, one person did it, and we all can. Thank you so much, Melissa, for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me on to talk about the book.
Melissa Murray is the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at New York University School of Law and the author of The U.S. Constitution, a comprehensive and annotated guide for the modern reader. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. First things first, commit to voting. We see how much distortion has come from partisan gerrymandering. It's not a panacea, but we need to redouble our efforts to get people to the polls. Get your documents and then get a friend to vote with you. We need to double the size of this electorate. The second thing is to call your member of Congress with your questions. Ask them what their stance is on court reform and the Voting Rights Act, and then demand that they do something about it. Next week on Future Hindsight, we'll be joined by Steve Phillips. He's the founder of Democracy in Color, a political media organization dedicated to race, politics, and the multicultural progressive New American Majority. His new book is Are White Men Smarter Than Everybody Else? Playing offense in the fight for racial justice in America.
To me, multiracial democracy looks like a society and a democracy and a government where the participants and the leaders reflect the participants and the population of the country.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. And while you're there, please, please, please leave us a review. It really goes a long way for other listeners to discover our podcast. And if you're listening on browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We're here to build your civic action toolkit every week, so follow Future Hindsight now and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent, pro-democracy podcast, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Head to youtube.com/futurehindsight now. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.